Welcome to the Tech Magic Labs channel. This channel aspires to share the magic and wonder of technology. Today, we continue with our developer productivity series where we'll set up Visual Studio Code. When you first install Visual Studio Code, this is what it will look like. Pretty plain, pretty boring, quite uninformative. We are going to transform it from something like this to something like this, with some amazing themes, which of course you can customize to your heart's desire, and some very useful tools known as extensions in the Visual Studio Code ecosystem. In my case, I have something that allows me to render my markdown files that you see, as well as a bunch of other goodies that I have set up that I'm going to walk you through. Now, first, we start with the tell part of our show and tell. Visual Studio Code and its ilk are known as Integrated Development Environments, or IDEs. These are software applications that help programmers develop software code efficiently. It increases developer productivity by combining capabilities including software editing, building, testing, and packaging in an easy-to-use application. This is very important because this is where, or the IDE is where a developer spends a majority of their time. Again, building software, testing it, packaging it, and deploying it, right? And hence, it's very important that you spend time to set up your IDE of choice to what works for you, as this will be a huge productivity boom. Now, jumping into VS Code, which, by the way, there are a whole bunch of options out there as well, right? There's the JetBrains family of language-specific IDEs, which are very popular. There is the Atom, which GitHub built and maintained. I don't think they're maintaining it anymore. And the new kid on the block, Zed, which is a Rust-powered IDE, still very new and with a very, of course, immature extension ecosystem at this stage, but still looks pretty promising. And of course, there's a whole bunch more that I'm not mentioning, but that you may be aware of. So what is Visual Studio Code? Visual Studio Code, also known as VS Code for short, is a cross-platform source code editor developed by Microsoft. Similar to other modern IDEs, users can change the theme, keyboard shortcuts, preferences, and install extensions that add functionality, customizing it and making themselves even more productive. Now, why VS Code? As I mentioned earlier, there's a whole bunch of options out there. So why specifically VS Code? Well, first off, it's cross-platform, which means it's on macOS, Linux, Windows, and now the web. If you ever go to github.com and you're browsing through a repo, replace the .com with .dev and you'll see what I mean. That's all powered by the same technology that powers Visual Studio Code. Pretty cool. Secondly, it's free, right? Which is the best price in the world. Third, it supports multiple programming languages. Going back to what I mentioned, JetBrains has a bunch of language-specific tools out there. PyCharm is one that I've used in the past and I'm a really huge fan of. However, if you take the example of a full-stack developer, web developer in this case, you, in any given day, might be working with HTML, CSS, JavaScript, or JavaScript frameworks such as React or Astro or the likes. And on the back end, you might be using Node or Python or something more esoteric or something more modern such as Rust or Golang. These are all tools that would be great to have the same tool to use, right? And with VS Code's great extension ecosystem, you have support for all of these program languages in one place. You don't have to switch tools. Everything is there, ready for you to use. Coming to my case, I use JavaScript, TypeScript, Python, Golang, and Rust, and I use Visual Studio Code. That is my IDE of preference. Now, enough about talking about VS Code. Now that we know what we're going to do, let's jump to the show part of this. Now, as a heads up, I will be using Visual Studio Code Insiders Edition as I have Visual Studio Code already installed in my machine, as well as the other alternative, which is Visual Studio Code, which I'll explain momentarily. All right, to install Visual Studio Code, you can navigate to code.visualstudio.com and you can see that you can download for your OS of choice, macOS, Windows, and Linux. Do note one thing, that is that there is a stable version, which is the one I recommend you start with, and there is an insider's version, which is maybe Microsoft's beta program, where it gives you access to some of the upcoming features and settings and capabilities that the Visual Studio Code team is working on. And of course, by its nature, it is more unstable than the stable version. If this is your first time installing, highly recommend you go with the stable version. Now, as an alternative, I want to introduce you to VS Codium. Now, of course, VS Code is an open source editor. However, the binary that is distributed by Microsoft includes some of Microsoft's telemetry for capturing user information and other pieces of info that they would like to track. To that end, a community has sprung up to provide a fully open source binary of VS Code, which doesn't ship with any of the Microsoft telemetry, which is, of course, by nature closed source. But for today, I will actually be installing the Insider Edition because I already have Visual Studio Code installed, and I want to walk you through some of the base steps that I do when I first get this. So let's start by downloading, which should take a moment. There we go. Something to keep in mind here is that all of the programs and tools that I use in my day-to-day are actually installed through the command line thanks to Homebrew. I'm just walking you through this manually to show you. There'll be a separate video at the end of the series where I show you how I pretty much install all the things I'm going through manually right now for learning purposes in an automated way, which has cut down drastically the amount of time it takes me to set up my machine. Okay, with that, I'm gonna just install. Okay, I have installed Visual Studio Code Insiders Edition. In your case, you would have installed the Visual Studio Code Stable Edition, and I've opened it, and this is what it looks like with this welcome page that shows up at startup. So I'm just going to zoom in with Command Plus, and maybe zoom in again just for it to be easy to follow. And you can see there's nothing. There's no folder I've opened. There's absolutely nothing set up so far. I've not logged into anything. No backups, no nothing. Okay. So first thing that I like to do is I can make the terminal visible by clicking on Control and tilde. Tilde is the button that's right next to the number 1 to the left. Otherwise, we can go to View and Terminal. So again, this is being Mac. If you're in a different system, it will show you the shortcut. Okay, so here's our terminal. And this is, again, the same terminal that is just our regular terminal right now. Okay. So one of the first things I like to do is actually install the shell command. So this shell command will install Code Insider's command in path. This allows me to spin up or open Visual Studio Code from the command line, which I'm already in, right, from the terminal. So that's one of the first things I'll run. I'll allow it. Okay, it's going to prompt us for our password, so we're going to give it that in. Okay, so a way to check that is, of course, running code. I have to restart our shell and type in, okay, I'm going to type in the lazy way. Beautiful, which Code Insiders is there. Now, the other thing I like to do, being a really lazy programmer, is I don't want to type out Code Insiders. And in my case, I already have code installed, so I have that. So the advantage of installing this shell command is now that we can launch Visual Studio Code from the terminal, which we might already be spending quite a bit of time on. As an example, I'm going to create a brand new folder. Let's go into that folder. And I am going to call Code Insiders and open this specifically. Let's see. And there you go. Yes, I trust the authors. I will just trust all the authors there. There we go. So now we are, again, going and opening up my terminal view and expanding this. PWD. Well, there you go. This is now in the new folder that we just created, right? Great. Installing the shell command and adding it to our path is a great way to speed up our productivity, as we can naturally navigate to a directory, a repo that we're working on, and open up our IDE right there and then and get to working. Now, switching back to our original IDE window, this is what we've installed, right? Now, me being me, I do not want to be typing out code insiders, or in my case, code each time. So what I like to do is to set up an alias for code insiders. Now, in the case of code, which is my stable version, I do have an alias, which C. Again, it just makes it easier. I usually do C dot, and I can launch whatever I want instead of having to type code dot. Yes, it's the small things that count, absolutely. So I would alias CI to code insiders, and this is how I would create an alias. Now, of course, this alias right now, as I run this, will only be created for this specific shell that I have open, but I can take this and put it to my zshrc file that we created last time. Okay, so now being able to, so you see again, CI is green, which means that Zish is telling me this is a valid command, which of course we know as we just set this up. Now, and I do this, and well, that's a dud. Oh, okay. Of course, I had a typo in in my alias. I meant to do this. So as a verification, I can do which CI. CI is alias to code insiders. Now when I launch CI dot, there you go. It opens the same new directory that I created and opened right before. So great, now I have my alias. So now, again, the beauty is any terminal, from the terminal, as I'm navigating from here to there, I can just quickly open my application or my Visual Studio and start. Again, if you are using the regular one, I encourage you to use C. C also, just from a search, one of the first things you probably want to do before you set it, just as a heads up, is you want to verify that C is not aliased to anything or doesn't have or doesn't refer to any program. I confirmed this beforehand before I aliased it. All right. So now that we've aliased, what's the next thing we should do? Let's go to settings. So going to settings. One of the things that I find really, frankly, unintuitive and unhelpful is the UI version of VS Code settings. It's just always hard to find what I'm looking for, and I can never figure it out. So one of the first things I always do is change this view into JSON view. Workbench, settings editor, convert this to JSON, and open default settings. I enable this. This allows it to show the default settings on one side. This gives us a split view. Controls whether opening settings also opens an editor showing all default settings. Yes. So now what I can do is I can close this and let's open. And there we go. For me, at least, this is a much more intuitive and easier to understand. Now, of course, a lot of folks out there have recommended Visual Studio Code settings that are usually found in JSON format. And this way, of course, if nothing else, you can copy paste it, but we'll set up sync momentarily. So this is the two settings I first start with. And I can also add workbench dot settings. I have a spelling. Dot settings dot split JSON true. And of course, this is being a valid JSON file. We have to make sure that it remains, and then we have to do save. Okay. For the next setting, I first have to show it to you so it makes sense. So opening up our brand new Hello World directory, and let's turn into full view. Let's Command plus, zoom it in. Then let's just open a simple Python file. So say touch hello.py, print hello world. Okay, so we have, now note already that Visual Studio Code will start to recommend proactively some extensions for based on the file or the file type that we're using. So in this case, we created a Python file, and it's recommending a very popular Python extension for Microsoft. We'll get to that shortly, so let's ignore that for now. Okay, so let's just print hello world. And of course, one of the things to note is that this circle indicates that there's been a change in the open file, and I need to do something. So let's just try this first. Well, nothing happened. Why? Because the line that I added has not been saved. So let's save it and let's run it again. Great, hello world. Now let's add print I am a script. Let's go to run it. Of course, I'm being a little facetious, but you hopefully get the point. I have to save and then run in order for it to reflect the latest changes. As you can imagine, this is very tedious, and doesn't matter, is it Markdown or your programming language or your script or your program. This is really tedious to do. It's very nice to be able to speed this up. So one of the other settings I like to set up is the files.autosave and say on focus change. Now, of course, as you can see, running back, there's after some delay, of course, the default is off, and on focus change and on window change. So let me just comment out and show you something on this side. This is why I like the split view of showing all the default settings. Now I can just search for autosave, and I can read about, if I'm curious, what all the different settings are, right? So of course, off being off, it won't change and nothing will ever be automatically saved. After some delay, whatever you set that delay to be, it will save it automatically. On focus change is when you just click anywhere else on the editor. But if it's window, it's of course the Visual Studio Code window. I personally prefer the on focus change because I could switch to a different tab or click the terminal and we can save it. So let's do that. Let's remove this and let's have the recommended on focus change. Let's try that. Now note again, when I click somewhere else, my settings.json file has not actually been updated. That's because I first need to do this initial save, and it will save each time. Just as proof, I'm going to add another common setting that I have. So now clicking the terminal, note it's been saved and it's reflected. So now switching back to our Hello World example, can you autosave? Right, now clicking to my terminal, I can run it and my settings are saved, or my file changes are saved, and I can just proceed. This is super great because when you're developing a script, you can just focus on writing, running, not writing, saving, and running. Or oftentimes we might even forget to save and try to run it, and of course realize our latest changes do not reflect. Automate this away, unburden yourself. Another setting that has been now baked into VS Code itself is this bracket pair colorization that we might have already seen in our Hello World example. It used to be a separate extension, and thankfully the folks at VS Code have built it in. So we can go to editor, bracket, enabled, and as we note, by default it's set to true. What does this actually do? It controls whether bracket pair colorization is enabled or not. What does that actually mean? Well, let's just turn it off and see what it does. Right? So note, even in our settings, which again automatically the settings are automatically, the file changes are automatically updated. It has changed, right? This used to be color coded or not. Let's switch over to our Python script and take a look. Well, I added a few more things just to try, but you can see that although there's a bit of a highlighting to figure it out, it's really hard if you have a whole bunch of brackets within brackets within brackets, right? Which is probably more common in the JavaScript world rather than the Python world. Regardless, let's look at this, and then let's go back to enabling it. True. Let's click somewhere else, and there you go. Our settings are now highlighted. Now we switch back to our Python code. We can see that this has been highlighted, and then also the bracket colorization has also been highlighted so that you can tell which goes with which. Now, switching gears and jumping to the world of extensions. Let's close our settings.json file, and let's go to the extensions. Now, of course, when you first go, we have nothing installed, 0. You'll see a whole bunch of popular and what's recommended. Now, of course, earlier, right, opening our Python 1, it did recommend we install the Python extension. And you can see here, it gives us an option of installing pre-release version or the release version. I believe this is because we're running the Insider's edition, that it would, I think you can also do the regular one, as in when you're using the stable version of VS Code, you can install the release version by default, but when you're rolling the Insider's edition, it'll default to installing pre-release version where available. Let's just install the release version. And note here that just clicking this installs a bunch. Okay, there we go. That's great. Yep, okay. Yep. So this walks us through setting up our extension, and we have testing. Now let's open let's take a look. This installs quite a few. Let's just hide our terminal for now. Yes, so installs Pylance, which is a very popular language server for Python, also by the great folks at Microsoft. And you can see it's very popular with over 94 million installations. And then Python, I believe, which is the most popular extension out there in VS Code, has over 122 million installations, right? Yep. And so when we look, we actually have 3 now. Just closing all of this, we can see that we have 3 extensions installed: Pylance, Python, and Python Debugger. And note that this just showed up, allowing us to configure and run our Python tests. Right. So of course, depending again on your language and what you're using, you'll have a whole range of tools out there for you to install. So for example, let's just look up Rust. Rust has the extension for Rust, which has about a little shy of 300,000 installations. The Rust Analyzer, which has 3.2 million installations, and so on. If we go over to Golang, you can see that there is Go language support, which is from the Go team at Google, has 12.5 million installations. Now, if we open something like Node, yep, so there's even a search Node modules and a whole bunch of other extensions that you can continue to explore. Now, coming back to this, here's one of my favorite extensions, and this solves, at least for me, a very key problem. I tend to have multiple Visual Studio Code windows open. And when I mean multiple, I mean 6+. How do I identify when I do something like this, right? I'm not sure that actually worked. But so in Mac, when you click Control down arrow, you can see all the open windows of your current application. So again, when I have Visual Studio Code, I may have 6, 9 windows open as I jump around from project to project. How do I know which one is which? Peacock is there to solve this problem. This is a great extension. So let's first install it and see what it actually does. Install. Okay. Now that we've installed the Peacock extension, let's take a look what we can do with it. Now opening our command palette, which is Shift Command P, type in Peacock, and we can change to a favorite color to Peacock Green. Let's try that. There we go. So what did Peacock do? Peacock has changed the outlier color of our window, which makes it easy to identify which window that we're working on, especially when we have multiple windows open. So now we've started to customize Visual Studio Code to what we want to use as developers, and adding the extensions, whether it's language specific or it's something that helps speed us up, or it's something just in the built-in settings, we're on our path to customizing to our heart's desire. Now that we've done that, we need to make sure that we're able to back it up, right? As developers, we most of the time have at least two computers, a personal and a work one. And we want to be able to sync these systems together so that the same IDE experience that we have in one is also available in the other. So this is the final extension I'm going to show you, which is the sync. Actually, this is better because this is not even a sync. This is not an extension. It used to be an extension. So this used to be a very popular extension for a few years ago by Sean Khan called Settings Sync. Thankfully, Microsoft has built a settings sync functionality into Visual Studio Code. So that's the one we're going to be using. So even better yet, there is no extension that you need to install for this. So let's just go to Shift Command P, Command Palette, and go to Sync. And let's set this up. Back up in Sync Settings. Let's say, okay, so you have to sign in using okay, yep. So because multiple environments. So in my case, I'm gonna actually short circuit this a little bit and sync to my stable version. I have not set up the insiders before, but just to show you how the benefit of syncing all of this and how much faster it allows you to be. So let's go to stable. I'm gonna go ahead and log into my GitHub, which I've already logged into off screen. Okay, yep, of course. So there are some conflicts detected. Of course, this is again comparing my local settings against my remote. I want to see these conflicts before I edit them. Okay. So one more thing I do want to show before I continue on to syncing my settings is that the actual extensions that I have, which you can search or you can get a list of by code space -- list extensions. Again, let's go back to using code insiders. We can do list extensions. And we can see that the ones that we installed, right? So we installed Peacock, we installed Python, which installed the debugging, the Python one, as well as Pylance, the language server for Python. And so we can see the 4 extensions that we have installed. But now if I switch over to code -- list extensions, you can see all of the extensions I have installed. And this is again the beauty of using the sync capability, because now I'll be able to sync everything. So what I would want to do is actually overwrite all of these settings and show you the power of syncing everything. And before I complete this merge, the reason I'm showing you the sync before I show you a whole bunch of extensions is this. As you start taking those steps to customizing Visual Studio Code, it's of course very important that you start backing it up, right? And start iterating upon it, because this will literally back up everything, your extensions, your settings, keyboard shortcuts, and all of that, right? So now going back to sync settings, let's complete this merge and see what happens. Well, it's turning it on. So you can see here some, yeah, we can go to output and take a look. And we are seeing live as all, let's just cancel that. Let's just cancel that. And there you go. My sync goes completed. And it took about 156 milliseconds. What a beauty. What a beauty. All right. And again, I promised you that this is what your Visual Studio Code would look like at the end of the session. Of course, this is my own theme to my preferences. Your theme can be completely different, of course. So let's go to our terminal and a sanity check. Let's see the extensions now installed. Well, that is a whole bunch more of extensions than the 4 we had, right? And again, in my case, these are all the extensions I use and are backed up. Also, more importantly, of course, you can see all of this has now been populated. And if I go to command, in Mac, of course, you can do command and comma to show up your settings. And you can see all of my settings are now there. So we went from, was it six lines of settings to about 443, which I'm of course constantly evolving as time goes, and as I install new extensions, they're being added, removed, and so on. So scrolling back up to the top, one last thing I want to show you is the beauty of sync settings is that you can control some extensions and settings that you want to ignore. So for example, if you have a Mac, a Windows, or Linux, or cross-platform, if you roll cross-platform, the paths might be quite different, right? So for example, NeoVim is a modern version of Vim, a popular editor. The path that you have in your Linux system will not be the same as the path you have in your Mac system, right? And same thing where, in my case, for example, I like to use Code GX, just playing around with something different from GitHub Copilot, which I get to use at work. So I would want to only have these enabled in my personal computer, while I would want to have anything related to GitHub Copilot enabled on my work computer. Another OS-specific path, which is for the popular formatting tool Black for Python, and same thing for Flake8, again for Python, as well as the extra paths I sometimes customize depending on a project. And next, of course, ignored extensions. So CodeGEX, which is ignored, Codium, which is also ignored. These two are alternatives to Copilot that I use. And of course, GitHub Copilot and its variants also ignored in extensions. So these are settings that are not backed up and therefore may obviously exist in one of your systems, but not the other. Okay, I will walk through settings another time in much more detail, but this should hopefully get you started and set you up for a great foundation to customize, right? So let's recap what we did in today's session. We installed VS Code. We set up some sane defaults, such as making sure the settings showed up as JSON, not the UI, which personally I find super unintuitive and hard to discover. We set up a theme when we actually downloaded an existing backed up setting through sync settings. And we went through some extensions, some plugins to get us started. So again, hopefully this sets you up for a great foundation to iterate and build upon. There are a ton of VS Code extensions out there constantly being developed, constantly being built. And of course, depending on your role, are you a DevOps engineer? Are you a data scientist? Are you a web developer? You'll have quite different extensions that you care about, right? Different languages, different tools that are more appropriate for use in your domain. But this should get you started and to making sure you're backing it up, customizing it, and iterating. From here, you can evolve it to your heart's content. And with that, thank you for watching this video on our developer productivity series. See you in the next video.